before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The land stretched flat and colorless beneath the morning sun, its silence broken only by the slow creak of saddle leather and the faint jingle of spurs. Elias Boone rode alone, his horse's steady gait matching the rhythm of his own breathing. Dust clung to his coat. His face was drawn tight from days without proper rest. His right hand rested close to his holster out of habit. Not fear. Out here, movement meant life. Stillness meant risk. Boone had learned that lesson years ago when he was a lawman, a deputy under a territorial marshal, tracking down outlaws across the dry plains of Arizona. That life had dissolved along with the office. And now, his badge had turned into something far heavier, a private burden. The raid he was tracking wasn't just another job. It had become personal. The wagon train he followed had been carrying settlers, families, children, and a store clerk he'd known from Yuma, who had promised him news about a wanted man named Wade Fallon. 3 nights ago, that train had been ambushed near the border. Every track Boone found told a story of panic, horses bolting, men firing blindly, and wagons set aflame. He followed the trail, knowing that the men who had done this didn't care for the innocent. They shot for sport and left their victims for the buzzards. The heat was stifling by noon, the sun bearing down relentlessly. Boone stopped near a dry wash, kneeling to study a series of hoof prints. They curved toward the south. He noticed smaller tracks nearby, barefoot, light, deliberate. Apache. He moved his hand to his revolver instinctively. His eyes scanned the ridges and brush, searching for movement. Out here, you never let your guard down, not even for a second. Then, a faint rustle came from the mesquite ahead. His heart rate quickened, and his hand tightened around the grip of his gun. From the brush emerged a woman, young, maybe in her early 20s, her face painted with a streak of white across her cheek. Her hair was tied back with a leather strip, and her body was tense but controlled. She held a bow in her hand, an arrow nocked and ready. She moved with practiced grace, every motion precise, betraying an upbringing in the harshest of lands. She had been on foot for days. "Don't move," she said, her voice clipped, but not trembling. She wasn't afraid. She had learned not to be. Boone didn't move. He saw the way she held the bow. Proper form, no bluffing. He wasn't looking for a fight. But out here, you didn't get the luxury of trusting anyone. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said, his voice calm but low, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're alone out here. That's dangerous country." She studied him for a long moment. The eyes that looked at him were filled with something deeper than caution, something that said she had seen death up close. Her gaze lingered on the badge pinned to his vest, dulled by the harsh sun. "Well, man?" she asked, her accent clear, but her English solid. "Used to be," Boone replied, his jaw tightening. Her bow lowered slightly, but her shoulders stayed tense. She wasn't done sizing him up. "I'm looking for my brother," she said, voice steady. "He was taken after a raid near the river. Maybe by the same men you follow." Boone's heartbeat steadied, his pulse coming to an almost deliberate pace. This was the connection he needed. Someone who had seen the aftermath of the attack. The hunt had just taken a turn, and it wasn't just about revenge anymore. "Then we're chasing the same trail," Boone said. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. "You saw them?" "I saw the smoke," she replied, her gaze hardening, remembering the night. "They rode east. My brother's tracks were with them. He's young but strong. He'll fight." Boone looked past her to the horizon. The sun was dipping lower now, casting the land in copper and gold. He calculated the distance. 6, maybe 7 hours ahead of them, depending on the terrain. "You have a name?" he asked, studying her face intently. "Nia," she said simply. She hadn't offered much, but then again, she didn't have to. He nodded. "Elias Boone." Nia didn't answer, but her grip on the bow eased slightly. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the dry wind and the distant call of a lone bird. Boone's mind raced through possibilities. Traveling together was risky. She could slow him down, or worse, draw trouble to them. But her knowledge of the land was worth more than another man with a gun. He motioned toward his horse. "If we ride together, we might find them faster." You help me find the ones who took your brother, and I'll see that you both walk away alive." She stood there for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the offer. She didn't trust him. Boone could see it, but then she didn't trust anyone. Her eyes flicked briefly to the horizon, then back to him. "I don't trust settlers. Or their lawmen," she said, voice quiet but firm. Boone half smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have to. Just stay alive." They started walking side by side through the dry wash, Nia's bow slung over her shoulder, Boone's rifle resting across his saddle. Neither of them spoke for a long while, each keeping their distance, each watching for signs, tracks, ash, anything human. The edge of fatigue began to creep in. Boone could feel like an old friend, dulling his senses, blurring the line between focus and survival. But every now and then, he caught Nia's movements from the corner of his eye. She was a shadow, a fluid extension of the land itself. Her instincts were sharp, her gaze moving methodically over the terrain. There was discipline in her actions. It wasn't pride. It was learned necessity. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, Boone finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was a roughness to it that betrayed the years of silence he had lived with. "You said they took your brother," he asked. "How old?" 17, she replied without turning. "Our tribe split after the soldiers came last winter. He stayed with me. Then he was gone." Boone felt a tightening in his chest, a familiarity in her words. He didn't show it, but it was there. He'd seen that look before, the one that said loss had already been accepted, but never spoken aloud. The kind of loss that leaves a permanent mark on your soul. "I'll find him," he said simply. She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. The hesitation in her eyes faded. She didn't trust him, but there was something in his voice, something calm and steady, that made her believe he meant it. By the time dusk settled over them, they had found a rise of rocks to camp beside. Boone unsaddled his horse, gathered dry brush, and lit a small fire shielded from the wind. Nia sat apart, staring into the darkening valley below. The air smelled faintly of smoke, too faint for comfort. Boone chewed his ration jerky slowly, thoughts drifting back to the wagon train. The families buried in shallow graves, the wasted promises, the endless hunt. He wondered if this chase would end differently, or if it would be another line of graves under nameless stones. He had seen it too many times before. When he looked up, Nia was watching him quietly, her gaze steady. She was waiting for him to speak. "You don't speak much," she said. Boone shook his head. "Talking doesn't change much out here." She gave a small, tired nod, then turned back to fire. For the first time that day, Boone felt something shift between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something closer to it. Not spoken, not certain, but real enough to matter. They shared the silence like a truce. Tomorrow would bring danger. But tonight, they had the same purpose, to find the missing and to survive the desert long enough to do it. And for both of them, that was reason enough to stay by the fire until sleep finally came. The fire had burned down to a low circle of embers by the time the desert air began to chill. Boone sat against a rock, his hat tilted forward, one hand resting on his revolver, the other on his canteen. He wasn't sleeping, just drifting in a half-awareness that came from years of keeping one ear open for footsteps that didn't belong. Nia lay a few feet away, wrapped in a worn blanket, her bow and arrows beside her. She hadn't spoken in hours. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was a shared space of survival, the kind that didn't need filling with words. Before dawn, a sound stirred Boone's eyes open, the faint crunch of gravel under light feet. His hand went to the gun before he even thought about it. But the shape that emerged from the gray horizon was only Nia, her form outlined against the pale morning light. She was kneeling by a cluster of stones, touching the ground with her palm, tracing something. Boone stood slowly, his joints stiff. "They passed here," she said, her voice quiet but sure. 5 horses, maybe 6. They didn't go far during the night. Boone stepped closer, his fingers tracing the soft imprint of the hoofprint on the left side. The tracks were deeper now, more distinct. He could tell the riders had been carrying weight, probably supplies or prisoners. He studied Nia's face as she explained what she saw, impressed by her accuracy. She didn't guess. She read the ground like a story. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded slightly. "My father taught me before the soldiers came, before the tribe scattered." He said, "If you know how to read the dirt, no man can truly hide from you." Boone considered that for a moment. "Smart man," he said. She didn't answer, but her eyes softened briefly before she stood. "We should move. They're heading toward the canyons. There's water there." As they packed their gear and mounted their horses, Boone's mind wandered back to her words. She'd mentioned her tribe splitting after the soldiers came. She'd mentioned her brother, but she hadn't mentioned what happened to her parents. The question sat heavy between them, but he didn't ask. There were things a person wasn't ready to say until the time was right. He focused instead on the trail ahead. It was going to be a long day, but the heat was as punishing now that the sun was still low in the sky. The land stretched before them in dull shades of brown and yellow, the harsh beauty of the desert that could swallow a man whole if he didn't keep moving. As they moved, Nia glanced at his revolver again. This time, Boone caught her look. He had been aware of it ever since they started riding together. "You keep staring at it," he said finally, voice calm but direct. "Why?" Her reply came after a long moment. "I've seen guns before from soldiers, but never this close. Never held one." Boone slowed his horse, considering her. He knew the weight of a weapon, knew it wasn't just metal and wood. It carried a price. "You want to see it?" he asked. Her eyes flicked toward him, uncertain whether it was a test or an offer. Boone dismounted and held out the Colt, handle first. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Her fingers brushed the metal as she took it, careful, respectful. She turned it in her hands, checking the cylinder, the sight, the trigger guard. "It's heavy," she said quietly. "It should be," Boone replied. "A man shouldn't forget what it's for." She turned the gun over in her hands, studying it with a kind of reverence. "And how do you know when to use it?" Boone looked at her for a long moment. "When you've tried everything else," he said, his voice quiet. He took the gun back, holstered it, and swung back onto his horse. Nia seemed to think about his answer as they rode on. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the desert growing more oppressive as the day wore on. The land that looked lifeless last night shimmered with a kind of dangerous beauty. Pale ridges, dry arroyos, and distant mountains wrapped in hazy blue. The heat gnawed at them, but Boone kept moving, and Nia did the same. They kept an easy pace, neither rushing, but neither willing to slow down either. By mid-afternoon, they found themselves in a narrow canyon, the tracks splitting in two. Boone dismounted, kneeling to study the sand. The prints were fresher now, deep and sharp. The way they had stopped, briefly. Boone ran his fingers over the edges, tracing the markings. His eyes narrowed as he considered the options. "They made camp here yesterday," he said. Nia crouched beside him, inspecting the sand for herself. "You can tell that from just this?" she asked, disbelief in her tone. Boone nodded slowly. "You get good at reading it after a while. Trackers, scouts. You learn to notice the little things." They stood, ready to move, but Nia wasn't done yet. "You think he's still alive?" Boone didn't respond immediately. He just studied the direction of the canyon. His mind ran through every possible scenario, every risk. He had seen men die for less. But this time felt different. Maybe it was because of Nia, or maybe it was because he didn't want to believe her brother was dead. "I think we're close," he said finally. She looked at him, her gaze searching his face. "You'll find him, won't you?" Boone's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "I'll find him." They mounted again, the rhythm of their horses' hooves steady as they moved toward the next rise. The canyon walls rose higher, narrow and uninviting. It wasn't a place you wanted to be trapped. It was an ambush waiting to happen. Boone scanned the ridges ahead, his senses on high alert. He had been here before. Canyon country, where every shadow could be hiding a gunman. The desert didn't forgive mistakes. As the sun dipped low, they found a rise of rocks to camp beside. Boone unsaddled the horse, gathered dry brush, and lit a small fire. Nia sat apart, staring into the darkening valley below. Boone chewed on his ration jerky slowly, his thoughts heavy. The wagon train, the families, the names still buried in the dirt. When he looked up, Nia was watching him again. This time, her eyes weren't filled with suspicion. They were filled with something closer to understanding. "You don't speak much," she said. Boone shook his head. "Talking doesn't change much out here." She gave a small, tired nod and turned back to fire. For the first time that day, Boone felt something close to trust begin to form between them. Not spoken, not certain, but real enough to matter. Tomorrow would bring danger. But tonight, they had the same purpose, to find the missing and survive the desert long enough to do it. And for both of them, that was reason enough to stay by the fire until sleep finally came. The fire had burned low, casting faint shadows across the rugged terrain as the chill of the desert night set in. Boone leaned back against the stone, his eyes half closed, still alert despite the weariness that pressed against him. The desert silence had a way of making you listen more intently, like it was waiting for something to happen. And when it did, it would always come from the place you least expected. Nia sat across the fire from him, her eyes reflecting the flickering embers as she stared into the distance. Her face was unreadable in the firelight, but Boone could sense the tension in her shoulders. It had been a long day, the kind that weighed a man down, no matter how much he tried to keep his mind on the task ahead. "How old is your brother?" Boone asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had lingered between them for what seemed like hours. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, though her expression remained guarded. 17. He's always been stubborn. Thinks he can take on the world by himself. Boone nodded, understanding more than he let on. He had known men like that, young and full of fire, thinking they were invincible. It often ended in the same way, with the world taking more than they could give. "Did he leave you behind when the soldiers came?" he asked gently, not sure why he was pressing the question, but feeling like he needed to understand her better. Nia's gaze softened as she looked down at her hands, tracing the worn leather of her bow. "He stayed with me, but I couldn't protect him. Not the way I should have." Her voice trembled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I was supposed to keep us safe, but I failed him." The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than the desert night. Boone didn't respond at first. He understood loss in ways that could never be spoken. He had lost more than he ever cared to admit, but he'd learned to bury it deep, far from reach. "You didn't fail him," Boone said quietly. "Sometimes survival's the only thing you can control." Nia didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her pack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beaded necklace, the intricate patterns catching the dim light. It was beautiful, delicate, something that belonged to someone who had known peace. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice low. "She wore it every day before the soldiers came." Boone's eyes flicked to the necklace, his expression unreadable. The weight of her past, of the tribe she had lost, was now laid bare before him in a way that felt both intimate and painful. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to say next. "You don't need to explain it to me," Boone said, his voice rough with the understanding that came from walking through the same kind of grief. "You don't have to share anything you're not ready to." Nia looked at him then, the silence between them settling into something quieter, less charged. She hadn't expected this strange, unspoken connection. She had expected a lawman, a man who followed the rules. But instead, she found someone who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that sometimes survival was the only thing that mattered. As the night deepened, their conversation dwindled and the fire burned lower. Nia wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Boone sat with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the desert night. He wasn't sleeping. He couldn't afford to. When dawn came, the sky was still dark, but the faintest hint of light was beginning to stretch across the horizon. The first rays of morning kissed the peaks of distant hills, and the heat of the desert began to creep in again. Boone stood, stretching out the stiffness in his legs. "You think they're still ahead of us?" Nia asked as she rose to her feet, brushing the dust off her clothes. Boone nodded, adjusting his hat and pulling his saddlebag over his shoulder. "They're close. We keep moving." They mounted their horses, the sound of hooves steady as they rode toward the canyons. Boone's mind was already running through the possibilities. How many men, how many guns? Would they be vulnerable? His thoughts flickered briefly to Nia. She was quiet today, more so than usual. He could see it in her posture, tight, like she was holding something back. He could feel the weight of it, too. As they rode, the dry earth beneath them began to crack and break apart, the landscape changing in subtle ways, as if the desert itself was trying to escape the heavy silence. The wind blew in short bursts, rattling the bones of the land. And still, they moved forward. The canyon was ahead now, narrowing as they approached. The shadows lengthened across the rocky outcroppings, and Boone could already feel the familiar unease settle in his chest. The canyon was a perfect place for an ambush, narrow, confined, and without cover. "We move slow," Boone ordered, his voice low but steady. Nia nodded, her expression unreadable. The two of them had become a rhythm by now, each understanding the other's movements without the need for words. They moved like they had been doing this for years, a silent understanding between them, that neither wanted to speak aloud. The canyon walls rose around them, towering and close. Boone dismounted and moved ahead, his eyes scanning the terrain. The tracks were fresh, but there was something off about them. They had stopped. He crouched, tracing the patterns in the sand with his fingers. "They're here," he said quietly, standing up and signaling to Nia to follow. "Get your knife ready. It's about to get loud." Nia's hand went to the small blade at her waist, her grip steady. Her eyes never left Boone's, a silent exchange passing between them. They were close. The time for tracking was over. They would find what they had been chasing, and when they did, it would be over. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon, the moment of reckoning was finally upon them. Boone and Nia pressed forward, the sound of their horses' hooves muffled by the dust and stillness of the desert. The walls of the canyon closed in tighter, narrowing the space between them and the men they were hunting. Boone's mind raced through the plan, sharp, precise, calculating the risks, the timing. His instincts were honed from years of living on the edge, from countless confrontations in places like this, where life and death were separated by a single heartbeat. But this wasn't just another hunt. This wasn't about bringing in criminals or collecting a bounty. This was personal, for both of them. Ahead, they saw the telltale signs, broken branches, fresh hoof prints in the dirt. They were close. Boone could feel in his bones that old, familiar sense of danger crawling up his spine. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't alone. As they reached the narrow opening at the end of the canyon, Boone motioned for Nia to dismount. The silence between them stretched taut, like the calm before a storm. Nia's eyes locked on his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. She was no longer just a survivor, no longer just a girl who had lost her family. She was a warrior, fighting for the one thing that mattered more than life itself. "Family. I'll take the first shot," Boone said, his voice low and steady, his eyes scanning the canyon walls for movement. Nia didn't respond, but her posture told him everything he needed to know. She was ready. They crept forward, moving like shadows against the canyon walls. Boone's revolver was in his hand, the weight familiar and comforting. He had never been one to hesitate when the time came, and now, as the faint sound of voices echoed from ahead, he knew the time was near. Then, just as the canyon opened into a wide, barren stretch of land, they saw them, the outlaws, 7 of them, huddled around a campfire. Their eyes narrowed as Boone and Nia stepped into view, but there was no surprise. They had been waiting for them. Well, one of the men sneered, standing up and drawing his rifle. Look who finally showed up. Boone's hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his eyes cold and focused. He didn't move, didn't flinch. "You're outnumbered, Boone," the man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "What do you think you're going to do? Walk in here and take us all down?" Boone's expression didn't change. He had been outnumbered before, in worse places, with far fewer odds in his favor. "I don't need to take you all down," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of finality. "I only need to take you down. 1. The outlaw laughed, but the sound was hollow, like a man trying to convince himself that the end wasn't coming for him. He reached for his rifle, but Boone was faster. A single shot rang out, and the man dropped to the ground, his body twitching in the dust. The others froze for a heartbeat, staring at their fallen comrade. Boone didn't wait. He moved like lightning, his revolver singing death as he fired again, striking the next man before he could even raise his weapon. Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out, echoing to the canyon walls. But Boone was already moving, his body a blur of controlled violence. Nia wasn't far behind him. She was swift and deadly, her bow arcing through the air with precision, each arrow finding its mark. The remaining outlaws scattered, scrambling for cover, but it was too late. Boone and Nia had them boxed in, the canyon narrowing their escape routes. Every move they made was met with a bullet, every shot made with purpose. Boone's revolver kept spinning in his hand, each shot echoing with finality, each man falling one by one. When the dust finally settled, Boone stood in the midst of the carnage, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just transpired. The outlaws lay dead, scattered across the desert floor. Their reign of terror finally ended. Boone holstered his revolver, his expression hard but unyielding. Nia stood beside him, her bow lowered, her breathing heavy but controlled. She didn't say anything at first. There were no words needed. Boone glanced at her, his eyes flicking to horizon where the last traces of the sun were disappearing behind the mountains. "It's over," he said quietly, but the words didn't carry the relief he had expected. They were just words, and Boone knew better than to believe they meant anything in a world like this. Nia nodded, though she didn't speak. She knew what it meant, too. Outlaws didn't die easily. They left scars. They left memories that never truly faded. And even after the gunfire stopped, the road ahead would always be uncertain. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had fought for something worth fighting for. And in a world where so much was lost, that was the only thing that truly mattered. Boone turned his horse toward the north, his body aching from the fight, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Nia and Taza followed close behind, the three of them riding together under the fading light of the evening. The desert stretched ahead, vast and empty, but for the first time in a long time, Boone didn't feel the weight of it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and in that moment, the past seemed a little farther away. And though he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, he wasn't afraid anymore. Sometimes, Boone thought as the desert wind whipped around them, the greatest victory wasn't in bringing justice. It was in finding the strength to keep moving forward, even when the world around him was falling apart. And in that moment, he knew that he would keep moving, keep fighting, not for the law, not for vengeance, but for something worth protecting, something that could make all the pain, all the loss, feel like it had meant something. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, the echoes of the past seemed to fade. The road ahead was open, wide, and uncertain, but it was theirs to walk together. And for once, Boone didn't feel so alone. The West had always been a place for men like him, fighting for survival, fighting for justice. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to stop running. Time to find a home. Time to find peace. For the first time in a long time, Boone felt like he was heading in the right direction.